Over 3,400 years ago, an Egyptian army stood at the edge of disaster. Ahead of them was Megiddo, one of the most important cities in the ancient Near East. Behind its walls waited a rebellion. And between Egypt and victory stood a mountain pass so narrow that soldiers had to move through it almost one by one. The generals warned Pharaoh Thutmose III not to take it. Too dangerous, too slow, too easy for an ambush. But Thutmose looked at the obvious roads and understood something his enemies had also understood. No sane commander would take the narrow path. So that is exactly where he went. This is the Battle of Megiddo, one of the first battles in history recorded in real tactical detail. And it begins not with a clash of swords, but with a choice, a road, a gamble, and a pharaoh who refused to do the predictable. To understand Megiddo, we need to understand the man leading Egypt. Thutmose III was not born into a quiet throne. For much of his early life, real power had belonged to Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers. She ruled as pharaoh, built monuments, sponsored trade, and kept Egypt stable. But when Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III stepped fully into power, and the world was watching, especially Egypt's subject states in Canaan and Syria. To them, this was the moment. A new ruler, a possibly untested king, a chance to break free. A coalition formed, led by the ruler of Kadesh, with Megiddo becoming the great rebel gathering point. That choice was not random. Megiddo was a prize. It sat near major routes between Egypt and the empires of Western Asia. Whoever controlled Megiddo controlled movement, trade, armies, tribute, and influence. It was not just a city. It was a lock on the door between Egypt and the north. If Thutmose lost Megiddo, Egypt's empire in Asia could begin to unravel. So the young pharaoh marched, not for a raid, not for a symbolic punishment, but to crush a rebellion before it became contagious. Thutmose's army moved north from Egypt, passing through Gaza, then toward a place called Yehem. From there, the road to Megiddo split into three possible routes. Two of them were safer. One route went north, one route went south. Both were wider, more practical, and much easier for an army with infantry, horses, and chariots. The third route went through Aruna. That was the dangerous one. A narrow pass through the Carmel Ridge, a road where the army would stretch out into a long, vulnerable line. A road where the front could be attacked while the rear was still trapped miles behind. A road that looked almost designed for disaster. Thutmose called a council. His commanders told him what any sensible officers would say. Do not go through Aruna. Take the safe road. Take the wider road. Do not risk the army in a bottleneck. And honestly, they were not wrong. If the enemy had blocked the pass, the Egyptian army could have been trapped, cut apart, and humiliated before the battle even began. But Thutmose understood the psychology of war. The enemy would expect him to be sensible. They would expect him to avoid danger. So they guarded the sensible routes. Thutmose chose the insane route. The march through Aruna was brutal. The army could not move as a broad fighting force. It moved like a thread, man behind man, horse behind horse. The chariots, Egypt's prestige weapons, could not simply roll through in formation. They had to be managed carefully through the difficult terrain. At any moment, if the rebels appeared above them or blocked the exit, the Egyptians could have been destroyed in pieces. But Thutmose did something important. He did not send others first while he waited safely behind. The Egyptian account says he led from the front. That matters. In ancient kingship, courage was political currency. A pharaoh was not merely a manager of armies. He was expected to be the living image of power. And here, Thutmose turned personal risk into command authority. His officers had warned him. His army had doubted the route. So he put himself at the head of the column, not because it was safe, because it made everyone follow. Then came the astonishing part. The Egyptians emerged from the pass, and no enemy was waiting. The gamble had worked. The rebel coalition had positioned its forces near the expected roads. They were watching the exits where a cautious army would appear. But Thutmose came through the road they had neglected. Instead of marching into a trap, he arrived behind their defensive expectations. The army had crossed the most dangerous part of the campaign without being attacked. But there was still a problem. The Egyptian army was stretched out. The front had reached the valley, but the rear was still coming through the pass. Thutmose did not rush immediately into battle. He waited. This is where the story becomes more than bravery. This is command discipline. A reckless king might have attacked at once, A cautious king might never have taken the pass. Thutmose did both things at the right time. He took the dangerous route, then waited until his army could properly form. That balance is why Megiddo is not just a lucky surprise. It is a genuine military masterstroke. The next morning, the Egyptians prepared for battle. The army formed with a northern wing, a southern wing, and Thutmose in the center. In front of them stood the coalition: Canaanite rulers, Syrian allies, chariots, infantry, men who had gathered because they thought Egypt's grip could finally be broken. But now they faced an Egyptian army that had appeared where it should not have appeared. The psychological shock must have been enormous. Ancient battles were not only about numbers, they were about formation, morale, visibility, and panic. If men believed their position had been turned, if they believed the enemy had outsmarted them before the first blow, the battle could begin to collapse before it truly started. And that is what seems to have happened. Thutmose attacked. The Egyptian account, naturally, praises the pharaoh like a god of war. But beneath the royal exaggeration, the tactical picture is clear. The rebels broke. They fled toward Megiddo. Some abandoned their horses. Some left behind chariots decorated with gold and silver. The retreat became a rush for the city gates. And then the battle turned almost absurd. The people inside Megiddo shut the gates too quickly. The fleeing leaders had to be pulled up over the walls using clothing. Imagine that scene. A coalition formed to defy Egypt. Princes and commanders racing back to the city, not marching in triumph, not retreating in order, but being hauled over the walls like desperate fugitives. Megiddo had become a trap. And then came the mistake. The Egyptians had the enemy on the run. Megiddo was vulnerable. The city might have fallen immediately. The battlefield was covered with abandoned wealth: horses, chariots, weapons, armor, tents, precious materials. To an ancient soldier, this was not a minor distraction. Loot was payment, reward, proof of victory. The Egyptian army had won the field, but instead of pressing the attack, it began collecting trophies. That pause saved Megiddo from immediate capture. Thutmose understood the cost. The battle had been won in a day, but the city would now have to be taken by siege. And siege warfare was slow, expensive, and ugly. The Egyptian account says that if the army had not given itself over to plunder, Megiddo could have been captured at once. It is one of the most human details in ancient military history. A brilliant plan, a perfect surprise, a collapsing enemy, and then soldiers doing what soldiers have often done after victory. They grabbed the glittering things. History turned on discipline, or the lack of it. So Megiddo was surrounded. The Egyptians built an enclosure around the city. They cut it off. No one was allowed out. The siege reportedly lasted months. Inside were the rebel leaders, the same rulers who had tried to challenge Egyptian power. Outside was Thutmose, patient and watchful. This is why Megiddo mattered so much. The battle itself was dramatic, but the aftermath was strategic. Thutmose was not just trying to win one fight. He was trying to make an example. The Egyptian account says something powerful. Capturing Megiddo was like capturing 1,000 towns. That may be propaganda, but the point is real. All the rebel leadership was concentrated there. Take Megiddo and you break the coalition. Take Megiddo and the surrounding cities understand the message. Egypt is still here. The young pharaoh is not weak. The empire is not retreating. Eventually, Megiddo surrendered. The rebels were spared more than they were annihilated. That was also smart. Thutmose did not need ruins. He needed tribute. He needed order. He needed local rulers who would obey. So after victory, Egypt collected prisoners, horses, chariots, armor, livestock, precious goods, and tribute. Then Thutmose reorganized power in the region. The rebellion was crushed. Egypt's northern empire was secured, and Thutmose III's reputation began to grow into legend. But the reason we still talk about Megiddo is not only because Thutmose won. Ancient kings won battles all the time. Many claimed victories. Many carved boasts into stone. Megiddo is different because we have unusual detail. The route debate, the general's warning, the risky pass, the timing, the army's formation, the enemy flight, the looting, the siege, the booty lists. This is why Megiddo is often described as one of the first battles in history recorded in reliable tactical detail. The account was carved into the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak. It was royal propaganda, of course. We should never forget that. The Egyptian version is not neutral journalism. It praises Thutmose. It insults his enemies. It gives the gods credit. It turns politics into sacred destiny. But inside the propaganda is something priceless. A battlefield narrative, a commander facing options, an army moving through terrain, a decision that changed the outcome. That is why Megiddo feels strangely modern. It is not just the king smote the enemy. It is, here were the roads, here was the council, here was the risk, here was the decision, here was the result. For historians, that is gold, almost literally carved in stone. Megiddo would remain famous for centuries. Its strategic location kept drawing empires, armies, and kings. Later biblical memory would associate the place with Armageddon, from Har Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo. A battlefield became a symbol of the final battle. But long before that, before the apocalyptic imagination, before later empires marched through the same corridors, Megiddo was the place where a young pharaoh made a dangerous choice. He took the road no one expected, and by doing so, he turned geography into a weapon. That is the real lesson of Megiddo. The battle was not won simply by bronze weapons, chariots, or numbers. It was won by understanding expectation. The enemy expected caution. Thutmose gave them audacity. The enemy watched the safe roads. Thutmose took the narrow one. The enemy prepared for a normal campaign. Thutmose turned the campaign into a surprise. And in that moment, ancient warfare gave us one of its first recorded masterpieces. Not because it was the biggest battle, not because it was the bloodiest, but because we can still see the decision. Clear as daylight, a commander standing before three roads. Two safe, one dangerous. And choosing danger because danger was exactly what the enemy thought he would avoid. The Battle of Megiddo was not just Egypt defeating a rebellion. It was the arrival of Thutmose III as a conqueror. It secured Egypt's power in Canaan. It broke a coalition. It opened the way for future campaigns into Syria and beyond. And it left us one of the earliest detailed battle accounts in human history. A narrow road, a nervous army, a stunned enemy, and a pharaoh who understood one brutal truth: sometimes the safest move in war is the one that looks insane.